This is some jury charge practice that will be at like 200, I guess. And here we go for the record. The court instructed the jury in relevant part as follows. There are no specific guidelines concerning what is required to support a conclusion that a defendant physician acted outside the usual course of professional practice and for other than legitimate medical purpose in making a medical judgment concerning the right treatment for an individual patient. Physicians have discretion to choose among a wide range of options. Therefore, in determining whether a defendant acted without a legitimate medical purpose, you should examine all of a defendant's actions and the circumstances surrounding the same. If a doctor dispenses a drug in good faith in medically treating a patient, then the doctor has dispensed that drug for a legitimate medical purpose in the usual course of medical practice. That is, he has dispensed the drug lawfully. Good faith in this context means good intentions and the honest exercise of professional judgment as to the patient's needs. It means that the defendant acted in accordance with what he reasonably believed to be proper medical practice. If you find that a defendant acted in good faith in dispensing the drugs charged in this indictment, then you must find that defendant not guilty. For you to find that the government has proven this essential element, you must determine that the government has proven beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant was acting outside the bounds of professional medical practice, as his authority to prescribe controlled substances was being used not for treatment of a patient, but for the purpose of assisting another in the maintenance of a drug habit or dispensing controlled substances for other than a legitimate medical purpose. In other words, the personal profit of the physician. Put another way, the government must prove as to each count beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant dispensed the specific controlled substance other than for a legitimate medical purpose and not with the bounds of professional medical practice. A physician's own methods do not themselves establish what constitutes medical practice. In determining whether the defendant's conduct was within the bounds of professional practice, you should, subject to the instructions I give you concerning the credibility of experts and other witnesses, consider the testimony you have heard relating to what has been characterized during the trial as the norms of professional practice. You should also consider the extent to which, if at all, any violation of professional norms you find to have been committed by the defendant interfered with his treatment of his patients and contributed to an overprescription and or excessive dispensation of controlled substances. You should consider the defendant's actions as a whole and the circumstances surrounding them. A physician's conduct may constitute a violation of applicable professional regulations as well as applicable criminal statutes. However, a violation of a professional regulation does not in and of itself establish a violation of a criminal law. As I just indicated, in determining whether or not the defendant is guilty of the crimes with which he is charged, you should consider the totality of his actions and the circumstances surrounding them and the extent and severity of any violations of professional norms you find he committed. There has been some mention in this case from time to time of the standard of care. During the trial, the words medical malpractice may have been used. Those words relate to civil actions. When you go see a doctor as a patient, that doctor must treat you in a way so as to meet the standard of care that physicians of similar training would have given you under the same or similar circumstances. And if they fall below that line or what a reasonable physician would have done, then they have not exercised that standard of care, which makes them negligent and which subjects them to suits for malpractice. That is not what we are talking about. We're not talking about this physician acting better or worse than other physicians. We're talking about whether or not this physician prescribed a controlled substance outside the bounds of his professional medical practice. All right, and now continuing on with, it's in this same opinion, but this is just, is talking about their opinion, I guess, for the record. Under Section 841A1, the government must prove, 1, that appellant knowingly or intentionally distributed a controlled substance, 2, with knowledge that it was controlled under the law, and 3, that he did so outside the usual course of professional practice. With respect to the third element, the only one challenged by appellant on appeal, the district court instructs the jury extensively prior to its deliberations. On appeal, appellant argues that 1, the district court's instructions on the Section 841A1 charges improperly lowered the government's burden of proof. 2, Dr. Storick's expert testimony constituted inadmissible legal opinions. 3, the district court erred in excluding evidence from appellant's expert witness, Dr. Thomas Duke. And 4, there was insufficient evidence to support each of his convictions. We consider each argument in turn. Appellant first argues that by referring to norms of professional practice in the jury's instructions, the district court improperly allowed the jury to convict on a civil rather than a criminal standard of proof. We review the accuracy and adequacy of jury instructions de novo and will not reverse a conviction so long as the instructions taken as a whole adequately state the controlling law. Okay, I need light. Okay, back on the record. Because we find that the district court's instructions as a whole adequately articulated a criminal standard of proof, we find no error. The potential for juries to confuse the civil standard of care applied in medical malpractice cases and the criminal standard of proof applied in Section 841A1 prosecutions requires courts to exercise care in setting out the governing standard in the latter circumstance. We have previously considered the proper relationship between standards in 2 decisions that are relevant to our analysis here, even though neither involved a direct challenge to the propriety of Section 841A1 jury instructions. In Tran Trong Quang, we addressed a sufficiency of the evidence challenged by Tran, a physician also indicted under Section 841A1. Tran's argument in part was that the district court erroneously applied a civil negligence rather than a criminal standard of proof during trial. While acknowledging that the district court had during trial confused the 2 standards, we nevertheless concluded that the court's articulation of the criminal standard was correct when instructed the jury at the close of the case. The trial court made it clear in its jury charge that the government must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant prescribed the drug for other than legitimate medical purposes and not in the usual course of medical practice. It then recognized the broad discretion afforded doctors, instructed the jury to consider all of the defendant's actions, and provided specific examples of behavior that tended to denote illegitimacy, such as prescribing drugs without performing physical examinations or asking patients about the amount or type of drugs they want. We held that these instructions adequately articulated the government's criminal burden of proof and did not endorse the use of a negligence standard. Indeed, we concluded that the jury instructions not only captured the criminal standard, but arguably imposed a higher burden on the government than set forth in Moore by additionally requiring proof that Tran had written prescriptions without a legitimate medical purpose. In Alere, in response to an argument that the entire trial was infected with an erroneous standard of proof, we approved instructions that largely mirrored those in Tran Trong Quang, but more fully developed the distinction between the civil standard and the criminal standard. The district court in Alere distinguished civil standard of care evidence, explained the burden of proof necessary for a criminal conviction, and cautioned the jury that the critical issue was not whether the defendants had acted negligently, but whether or not they prescribed a controlled substance outside the bounds of their professional medical practice. Significantly, we recognized in Alere that merely because standard of care evidence might show that a physician contravened the civil standard, it need not be categorically excluded from a criminal proceeding. To the contrary, evidence that a physician consistently failed to follow generally recognized procedures tends to show that in prescribing drugs, he was not acting as a healer, but as a seller of wares. Similarly, we recognized that evidence that a physician deviated drastically from accepted medical standards is probative of criminal liability. With that guidance, we consider the challenge before us, which specifically focuses on the district court's jury instructions. The thrust of appellant's argument is that the district court erred in telling the jury to consider the extent to which any violation of professional norms you find to have been committed by the defendant interfered with his treatment of his patients and contributed to an over-prescription of or excessive dispensation of controlled substances. Appellant specifically focuses on the district court's use of the phrase norms of professional practice. However, after reviewing the jury instructions as a whole, we must find multiple reasons to conclude that the instructions here properly set forth the criminal standard required by Section 841A1. As was in the case of Tran Trong Quang and O'Leary, the court below cabined both its overall Section 841A1 instruction as well as its specific instructions on the third element within the requirement of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. This statement clearly articulated the proper criminal burden for the government and precluded conviction on a lesser civil standard of proof. The court then properly defined the scope of unlawful conduct under Section 841A1 by explaining that the government had to prove that appellant used his authority to prescribe controlled substances, not for treatment of a patient, but for the purpose of assisting another in the maintenance of a drug habit or some other illegitimate purposes, such as his own personal profit. This instruction set the proper threshold for conviction by placing unlawful conduct beyond the bounds of any legitimate medical practice, including that which would constitute civil negligence. In other words, the district court ensured that the jury could only convict appellant for conduct that was exclusively criminal in nature. Significantly, in order to satisfy this definition of unlawful conduct, the district court required the prosecution to prove not only that appellant acted outside the course of professional practice as required by Moore, but also that he acted for other than legitimate medical purposes. This additional requirement arguably benefited appellant by placing an even heavier burden on the government than otherwise required to establish criminal liability.